My husband brought his mistress to my father's funeral in black and let her stand where family should have stood. Not in the back, not near the door. At my elbow, beside the condolence book, where my father's friends, old mill suppliers, and 3 generations of Whitfields were filing past with casseroles, damp handkerchiefs, and that stunned church basement softness grief leaves on people. She leaned in close enough for me to smell her powder and whispered, "Don't worry. By tonight, you won't even have his name." Graham did not flinch. He only rested 2 fingers at the small of her back, as if guiding her into a place already cleared for her. That was the moment the room went strangely sharp. The lilies, the coffee gone burnt on the warming plate, my mother's empty side of the pew, my father in the next room, zipped into stillness. Then Mr. Keene, my father's executor, stepped in front of my husband, placed a brass key and a sealed letter into my hand first, and said, very quietly, "Your father asked me to wait until Graham showed himself." By the time the burial was over, people had already started handing me the wrong kind of sympathy. Not for my father, for my marriage. Women from church squeezed my hand too long. Men who bought feed and machine parts from Whitfield Mill and Supply would look at Graham, then at me, and lower their voices as if the indecency had happened to both of us equally. It hadn't. My father was in the ground. Graham was still moving around above it, straightening chairs, thanking pallbearers, taking casseroles from people who had known me since I wore white tights to Easter service and had my hair pinned back with crooked little bows. That was the first crack. He was already acting like the man left standing. I was 33 years old enough to know the difference between help and replacement, and young enough that people in town still said things like, "You've got time," when they meant I should not look as tired as I did. I had been keeping the books at Whitfield for years by then, though nobody ever said it that way. They said I helped my daddy with paperwork, as if payroll, vendor contracts, freight claims, tax files, and 3 generations of grudges written in ledger margins were just an extension of being a dutiful daughter. So while people hugged me and called me strong, I noticed what nobody else noticed first. Graham had the funeral home folder tucked under his arm, not because he had picked it up by accident, because he had positioned himself where the director handed it to next of kin. Inside were the flower invoices, cemetery receipt copies, the guest sheet, and my father's memorial contribution list. Mine to manage, mine by habit, mine by blood. Yet every time someone needed an answer, Graham stepped in with that low, steady voice of his and gave it before I could open my mouth. "We've got the family meal covered. I'll handle the mill staff. Nora doesn't need to worry about any of that today." It sounded tender if you did not know him. It sounded like love if you had never watched a man take your place one efficient sentence at a time. Celeste stayed close enough to be seen and far enough to be called respectful. Black dress, pearl studs, gloved hands folded at her waist. Once, near the church kitchen, she touched Graham's sleeve and he bent his head to hear her. Not much, just a small private tilt. But it landed in me like something dirty dropped into clean water. At the fellowship meal, Aunt Louise leaned toward me and whispered, "Who is that woman?" Before I could answer, Graham pulled out a chair for Celeste at the end of the family table. Not a cousin's table, not the overflow room, the family table. Pastor Wren paused mid-sentence. My cousin David stared openly. Even the women ladling green beans went quiet for half a beat. Graham smiled as if the problem was everyone else's lack of grace. "Celeste has been helping with some transition matters at the mill," he said. "Given everything Robert trusted us with, I thought it made sense." Us. That word stayed hot in my ears. My father had not trusted us. He had trusted me. He trusted me with codes, combinations, overdue notes, and the truth about which accounts were being floated and which vendors needed paying before Friday or they'd start talking. He trusted me because I was the one in the office at dawn with stale coffee and carbon paper fingers, while Graham shook hands out front and talked vision. Then Mr. Keene crossed the fellowship hall and stopped beside me with his plate untouched. "Nora," he said, very low, "do not open that letter here." I looked up. His face had gone the color old lawyers go when something they feared has begun exactly on schedule. "What is it?" I asked. "Your father believed Graham might confuse grief with opportunity." He glanced once toward the head table where Graham was standing behind my chair, answering questions meant for me. "He also believed you would know the difference." I felt the brass key inside my handbag press against the leather like a second pulse. Then my phone buzzed. It was a payroll alert from the mill bank account. Access permissions changed, and my name was no longer on the first approval line. The ugliest part was that none of it had come out of nowhere. People like to imagine betrayal announces itself with lipstick on a collar or a phone turned face down too fast. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it grows in the same house as devotion and learns your habits before it learns how to use them against you. By the time my father got sick for real, Graham had already learned how to enter a room as if he belonged in the center of it. He could carry copier paper under one arm, kiss my cheek at the office door, and make everyone think he was saving me, when half the time I was the one holding the whole place together. I did not see that clearly then. I saw a man who stayed. That matters when you are tired. My father's chemo years turned life into waiting rooms, insurance calls, casseroles, and the low hum of the mill office after everybody else had gone home. I matched invoices, checked line of credit balances, fixed payroll errors, and drove my father to oncology with a legal pad on my lap because he remembered things in fragments, and I was afraid to lose any of them. Graham stepped in around the edges. He took supplier lunches. He learned which dock doors stuck in damp weather. It felt like partnership. The first time he made me believe I was not carrying it alone was in the hospital parking garage after my father got bad news and then apologized to me for the trouble, like he was a guest in his own dying. I got him settled in the car, then came back from oncology with the discharge papers shaking so hard I could barely fit the key into the lock. Graham took the papers from my hand, set them on the roof of the car, and turned me toward him. Not roughly, just firmly enough that I stopped moving. He put one hand at the back of my neck, thumb under my ear, and pressed his forehead to mine. "I'm your family now," he said. Then he kissed my temple. Slow, quiet. The kind of kiss that feels like shelter when you have not slept enough to tell shelter from surrender. I remember the fluorescent light above us, the smell of concrete dampness and old motor oil, the way I closed my eyes 1 second too long because I wanted so badly to believe someone stronger had stepped into the doorway with me. That kiss sat in me for years as proof. The second memory lived in my father's office late one night. The cleaning crew had already gone. The building smelled like lemon polish laid over sawdust and machine grease. My father had left exhausted, and I stayed behind with the old ledgers open on his desk, a mug of coffee gone cool beside my elbow, trying to sort freight errors before payroll hit. Graham came in without knocking. He loosened his tie, looked at the stacks around me, and said, You're going to wear yourself into the floor." "I'm close," I told him. He moved beside my chair, crouched, and took my wrist in his hand. Not my fingers, my wrist, right over the pulse. Then he kissed the inside of it. "Your father's name stays safe with us," he said. Us again. At the time, it landed like relief, like being chosen not just as a woman, but as the person beside whom the future would be carried. What I did not understand was that those moments did not only comfort me, they trained me. They taught me to read certain gestures as loyalty, a hand at the back of my neck, a mouth against my temple, fingers closing around my wrist as if the pulse there was something a man could promise to protect. So when Celeste leaned close at the funeral and Graham did not move her away, it hurt in one place. When he let her sit where family should have sat, it hurt in another. But when I looked up during the fellowship meal and saw his hand settle at the back of her chair, 2 fingers brushing the nape of her neck in that same quiet, claiming way, I understood something colder than heartbreak. He was already teaching the room how to forget where I had been sitting. I did not open the letter until the house was quiet enough to hear the refrigerator again. After the last casserole dish left and my aunt finally stopped pretending she was only staying to help fold napkins, I went into my father's study and shut the door. The room still smelled like him even in May. Cedar, black coffee, legal pads, toner, that dry paper smell that clings to men who built their lives around files. His glasses were beside the green lamp. One cufflink still sat in the tray by the ledger cabinet. The sealed letter had my name on it in my father's block handwriting. "If Graham begins to speak for me, or for you, use the key before nightfall. Do not argue first. Open the wall safe behind the portrait. Then ask Arthur Keene what he saw in March." That was it. No comfort, no blessing, just instruction. I lifted the portrait over the filing cabinet and found the small steel safe behind it. The brass key turned cleanly. Inside sat a black ledger, a sealed packet marked Operating Agreement/Hold, and a flash drive taped to the shelf with 3 words beneath it in my father's hand. Not for Graham. I opened the ledger first. 6 weeks before my father died, there it was in the margin beside a consulting payment. C. Vale Retainer, approved by Graham. Wants optics softened before announcement. Celeste Vale. Not a guest, not funeral help, paid. And my father had noticed. I had barely taken that in when I heard voices in the kitchen. I opened the study door a fraction and looked through the crack. The overhead light was too bright. There were lipstick-ringed coffee cups by the sink, pound cake drying out on a paper plate, and condolence lilies dropping pollen on the counter. Graham stood near the island with his jacket off. Celeste stood close enough that nobody would have called it accidental. She reached up and smoothed his tie, slowly. Then her fingers moved to the side of his neck, just under his ear. Graham leaned into her hand the way he once leaned into mine in the hospital parking garage when he held the back of my neck and told me I was not carrying my father alone. My stomach dropped. Celeste tipped her face up. Graham bent and kissed her temple. The exact same kiss. The same quiet, claiming gesture I had carried through chemo schedules, late-night ledgers, and those exhausted hours when I thought his tenderness meant loyalty. For 1 second, the hurt came hard and stupid. My body wanted noise, a broken plate, a name spat across tile, something ugly enough to match what I had just seen. Then it sharpened into something cleaner, because I saw it all at once. He had not brought her to the funeral only to humiliate me. He had brought her to install her. At the condolence line, at the family table, in my father's kitchen. He was moving her through the house in plain view so the room would get used to her shape before anyone thought to object. If I walked in crying, he would get exactly what he needed. A grieving daughter too unstable to trust with a company, a trust, or a dead man's papers. Celeste would lower her eyes. Graham would soften his voice. By breakfast tomorrow, I would not be the woman whose husband brought his mistress to her father's funeral. I would be the woman who came apart. So I stepped back, closed the study door without sound, and opened the sealed packet. The first page was the operating agreement. Halfway down, my father had underlined one clause and written in blue ink along the margin. Graham asked twice to bypass Nora. Arthur heard the second time. Behind it was a draft request to add Graham as interim signatory if my father became incapacitated. My name had been crossed out in pencil, then rewritten in my father's hand so hard it nearly tore the paper. At that exact moment, my phone lit again. Emergency signatory review requested for Monday morning, requested by Graham Whitfield. I did not confront him that night. I came closest in the laundry room of all places. The ironing board was still up from where my aunt had pressed a black dress that morning. Somebody had left the stain remover open. Through the wall, I could hear dishes shifting in the sink, and Celeste's voice once, low and careful, followed by Graham answering in that steady tone he used when he wanted to sound useful. I stood there with my father's packet open in my hands and understood something I should have known sooner. A public scene would not ruin Graham. It would finish his work for him. He had spent months making himself look like the steady one, the man who could greet suppliers, carry casseroles, answer practical questions, and stand near grief without seeming shaken by it. If I walked into that kitchen shaking a flash drive and calling Celeste what she was, nobody would remember his paperwork. They would remember my face. So I put every page back in order. Operating agreement first, ledger second, flash drive inside one of my father's old deposit envelopes. I moved the brass key into the zip pocket of my handbag so it would not knock against anything if I had to leave quickly. Then I washed my hands at the utility sink because they smelled like old metal and toner dust, and I wanted nothing on me that felt frantic. When I came out, Graham was in the hallway outside the den. He had loosened his tie. His shirt sleeves were rolled halfway up. To anybody else, he might have looked like a grieving man who had done too much for too many people in one day. "You disappeared," he said. "I had to sort Daddy's papers." His eyes flicked once to my bag. "You don't need to do that tonight," he said. "Arthur and I can handle the legal side." Not family, not we. Arthur and I. "My father didn't leave his papers to you," I said. His face hardly moved. That was what chilled me. He had practiced not showing too much. "Nora," he said softly, "this is exactly what I'm worried about." "What are you worried about?" "You're exhausted. You've had a shock. People are already concerned." People. That word came dressed as concern and landed as a warning. Concerned daughters get guided. Concerned wives get moved aside for their own good. He stepped closer. "Let me get through tomorrow," he said. "Then we can sort what matters." Sort what matters. As if my father were an event. As if grief had made me too slow to recognize theft unless it came with broken glass. But he had given me something useful without meaning to. Tomorrow mattered. The church people would go home and start talking. The mill's small board would begin leaning toward whichever version of this family felt safest. And Monday morning, the bank would open on that emergency signatory review. So I nodded, as if he had calmed me. "You're right," I said. Relief crossed his face too fast. "You should sleep," he said. "I'll stay a little longer and make sure everything's settled." Settled. One more gentle word covering a man putting his hands where they did not belong. I went upstairs, locked the bedroom door, and did not sleep. I made lists instead. Arthur Keene, March. Second request to bypass Nora. Celeste Vale, consulting retainer. Optics softened before announcement. Emergency signatory review. Monday morning. Just before dawn, I called the only person at Whitfield who still treated numbers like moral objects instead of scenery. Margaret Boone answered on the second ring. I could hear a spoon against a mug and a farm report on low volume behind her. "Miss Nora?" she said. "I was hoping you'd call before he did." "What did he ask for?" "He tried to move payroll approvals and vendor release authority on Friday," she said. "Told me your father would have wanted less confusion." My father had been dying on Friday. "Did you do it?" "Not all the way." She lowered her voice. "But he came with paperwork, and Celeste was with him." My grip tightened around the pen. "What paperwork?" "Draft access forms, a consultant invoice, and something else I didn't like." She paused. "A housing file from the company house. Your name was paperclipped to the top." The company house. Not just my marriage, not just my father's business. By sunrise, I knew exactly what I was not going to do. I was not going to cry in front of him. I was not going to ask for mercy. And I was not going to let Monday arrive before I learned every paper he had already touched. Margaret Boone had worked the mill office since before I learned cursive, which meant she had spent 30 years watching men mistake access for authority. When I got there, the morning still smelled like wet gravel and diesel. Somebody had started the first forklift. The old coffee maker in the break room was already burning a second pot. Whitfield Mill and Supply looked the same from the road. Cinder block office, rust-red siding on the warehouse, faded sign out front. But once I stepped inside, I could feel the difference that comes when a place knows someone is trying to move its bones. Margaret met me in the accounting room with her glasses low on her nose and a stack of manila folders pressed to her chest. "I locked the back door," she said. "If Graham asks, I haven't seen you." That was trust. Then she set the folders down on the adding machine and tapped the top one. That's competence. Inside were printouts she should not have had unless she knew exactly when to make copies before a system changed hands. Access logs, payroll approvals, a scanned consultant invoice under Celeste Vale's LLC. 2 internal memos Graham had initialed but not yet filed properly. And on the very top, the Friday request Margaret mentioned before sunrise. Temporary authority realignment due to family hardship. I read it once and felt my jaw go tight. He had chosen those words because they sounded merciful. As if my father's death and my humiliation were only weather passing through the business, and he was the practical one with an umbrella. Margaret pointed to the signature block. He wanted me to route it straight through banking. On whose authority? He said Robert was too medicated to sign anything useful, and you were in no shape. There it was. The ordinary manipulation before any formal accusation ever arrives. Not a direct insult, a portrait. Frail father, emotional daughter, steady husband. Once that story settled, the rest of the papers could walk through on their own legs. I looked down at Celeste's invoice. Strategic Transition Consulting. 3 payments already made, 1 pending. For what? I asked. Margaret gave me the kind of look only older women can give younger ones when pity has already burned off. Apparently for standing in places she doesn't belong. Then I saw the vendor code tied to her invoice. It had been pushed through the family operations account, not Graham's sales budget. The same account that paid the company house utilities, my father's long-term care transport, and the insurance rider on the office records room. He had not just brought her near the business. He had started feeding her into the structure. Margaret reached into the second folder and handed me a carbon copy of a housing notice. Company Residence Occupancy Review. My name was on the top line. Graham's beneath it. There was a penciled note in the margin. Update after funeral. I looked up. He planned to move me out. He planned to make it look procedural, Margaret said. That's worse. It was, because procedures leave fewer fingerprints if nobody bothers to read them. I asked her about March. She went still for half a second, then nodded toward the closed office door. Arthur wasn't the only one who heard something, she said. Your father and Graham were in Robert's office, door mostly shut. I was posting freight overages at the side desk. Graham said the company needed a face that won't break under pressure. Your father asked if he meant him. Graham said no. He meant after. After what? After you were out. The room went very quiet after that. Margaret slid the last item toward me, a copy of an email printed from the server before it could disappear. Graham to a local banker. Subject line, interim continuity planning. 3 lines only. He wanted Monday morning kept discreet. He said public grief made certain family members volatile. He said he preferred to stabilize signatory authority before personal complications reached the staff. That was what he called me while I was still wearing my black funeral dress. I folded the paper once, then opened it again so the crease would not damage the print. Can you testify to where this came from? I can testify to what I printed, when I printed it, and who asked me to route what. She took off her glasses and looked at me full on. But Arthur is your finisher, Nora, not me. People around here trust me with numbers. They trust him with the dead. My father had not chosen Arthur Keene by accident. Before I left, Margaret caught my wrist just enough to stop me moving. He'll try tenderness again, she said. Men like that go soft when hard starts failing. When I stepped back into the hall, Graham was already there, leaning against the doorframe to my father's office, like he had been waiting for the scene he preferred. His voice was low, patient, almost intimate. You don't have the full picture, he said. Your father knew you weren't built for what comes next. And for the first time since the funeral, I answered him without shaking. No, I said. He knew exactly who was. Arthur Keene did not like being hurried, which was one reason my father trusted him. By noon, he was in the study with his legal pad open and his coat folded over one arm. The house had gone into that after-funeral quiet where every room looked used up. Half-wilted arrangements lined the dining room. The coffee urn sat cold. Somewhere upstairs, a floorboard settled and made me think of my father before memory corrected me. I laid out the ledger, the flash drive, and Margaret Boone's copies. Arthur read the margin notes first, then the consultant invoices, then the bank email. He did not speak until he reached the line my father had written in blue ink. Ask Arthur what he saw in March. He took off his glasses. Your father asked me to witness a conversation he hoped would never matter, he said. But he also knew, Hope is not a system. What did you see? He asked Graham whether he understood that Whitfield was staying in blood. Arthur glanced down once. Graham said, "Blood doesn't balance books, Nora." The words landed cleanly, coldly, like they had been waiting for me to hear them at the right time. Arthur went on. Your father told him the company was not up for marriage-based succession. Graham smiled and said, "Then you'd better pray she grows steadier hands." There it was. Not a husband worried about me. A man who had already decided I was too soft to keep what my father built. Arthur plugged in the flash drive. The first folder held emails. Graham to a family law attorney 3 weeks before my father died. Questions about separation timing, temporary residence rights, exposure control around grief events. One subject line read, "If filing waits until after services, optics improve." My mouth went dry. The second folder held security exports from the mill office. Graham and Celeste coming in after hours through the side door my father hated people using. Graham carrying the red finance binder. Celeste laughing at something. Then his hand settling at the back of her neck to turn her toward him. The same touch. Even in grainy footage, I knew it. Arthur clicked the last file. This one was from my father's office. No sound at first, just movement. Graham beside the desk, Celeste behind him, close enough that her dress brushed the back of his legs. She slid her hand under his collar at the nape of his neck, slow and proprietary. Graham turned, caught her wrist, and bent his mouth to the inside of it, right over the pulse. For a second, I forgot to breathe. It was the same kiss he gave me in that office when I was bent over ledgers and trying not to drown in my father's illness. The same private gesture I had mistaken for loyalty. Only now it was being used over my father's desk, with his files open, as if my marriage and his company were just 2 doors in the same hallway. Arthur reached for the mouse to stop the clip. "No," I said. So we watched the rest. Celeste leaned over my father's desk and tapped a folder with one fingernail. Graham nodded and took out his phone to photograph it. Not grief, not comfort. Inventory. That backup wasn't on the main server, Arthur said quietly. Your father kept it separate. He told me if Graham ever forced the room, I was to bring the room to him instead. Then he opened one final envelope from the safe. Inside was a signed codicil, dated 8 days before my father died. It moved controlling voting authority into a separate Whitfield trust under my name, and barred any spouse of mine from exercising interim control unless Arthur and the bank both certified I was incapacitated. My father had not trusted love. He had trusted paperwork. For the first time since the funeral, relief cut through the hurt. Not enough to soften it, just enough to give it shape. If Graham claims stewardship tonight, I can stop him, Arthur said. No, I said. We stop him after he claims it. Arthur looked at me for a beat, then nodded. That was the shift. The evidence was no longer only painful, it was usable. By then, the house had begun filling again, doors opening, chairs scraping downstairs. My cousin David asking for more ice. Churchwomen coming back with covered dishes for the legacy supper. I gathered the codicil copy, the emails, and the still frame Arthur printed from the office video where Graham's mouth touched Celeste's wrist. The image made me sick. It also made me precise. At the bottom of the stairs, Graham was waiting in my father's blue shirt, tie changed, grief rearranged into presentation. He glanced at the papers in my hand and smiled like charm still counted as leverage. Arthur, fill your head with worst-case stories? He asked. No, I said. You did that yourself. He stepped closer. "You're tired, Nora. And whatever Robert promised you, this company needs steadier hands than sentimental ones." Sentimental. There was the second contempt line, this time polished for public use. Then he touched my elbow lightly and said, "Let me take the microphone tonight. People need someone they can trust." Behind him, Arthur Keene came in through the side door with the sealed codicil envelope under his arm. And from the dining room, my cousin called that everyone was seated. The legacy supper had started. So had Graham's last mistake. Graham always did his best work when he could make theft sound like caretaking. By the time I came down to the legacy supper, the fellowship hall had been rearranged into something halfway between mourning and strategy. Churchwomen in black cardigans were setting out ham biscuits and funeral potatoes under fluorescent lights that made everybody look older and less forgiven. My father's framed photograph sat near the podium, his jaw set the way it always was when he knew a man was lying and wanted to see how far he'd take it. And Graham was already in position. He stood near the microphone with one hand on the back of a folding chair, thanking people for staying, guiding my uncle toward the front table, asking Pastor Wren whether the banker from First County had arrived. If you had walked in cold, you would have thought he was doing what any capable son-in-law would do after a hard burial. That was the danger of him. He never lunged where witnesses could see it. He arranged. He softened. He occupied. Celeste was at the head table, not beside him this time. That would have been too raw after the day they'd already forced on me. Instead, she sat on my mother's side of the room, angled toward the family, speaking in a low voice to Aunt Louise as if she had earned some right to gentleness there. Graham had placed her just far enough away to look tasteful, and close enough that every person in that room would begin absorbing her into the outline of our grief. Then he handed me an envelope. "Not here," he murmured. I opened it anyway. Draft separation terms, temporary residence transfer, voluntary withdrawal from operational responsibilities during bereavement. The language was so careful it almost impressed me. He had not only prepared to remove me from my marriage and my father's company, he had prepared to make me sign away the appearance of being removed. At the bottom of page 2, one line had been lightly highlighted. "To preserve the dignity of Robert Whitfield's memory, all family disputes shall remain private until transition is complete." I looked up. "You brought this to my father's supper?" His eyes did not waver. "I brought you away to avoid more damage." That was one of his best lies. Not because it sounded true, because it sounded reasonable. Before I could answer, Celeste rose to carry a tray of sweet tea toward the front. As she passed Graham, she let her fingers rest for one brief second against the center of his back. A private touch, worn publicly. He did not move away. By then I understood the pattern. He was teaching the room that her body belonged near his, and mine did not. I folded the papers once and slipped them back into the envelope. "You don't have to decide tonight," he said, lowering his voice. "But I suggest you don't make yourself smaller in front of people who are trying to remember your father well." That one was almost elegant. He was the man who brought his mistress to the funeral, and still he found a way to warn me against making myself small. I smiled at him for the first time all day, and that seemed to trouble him more than anger would have. "I learned that from watching you," I said. Then I walked past him before he could tell whether I meant it as surrender or insult. Arthur was in the coat room with his hat in his hands, waiting. Margaret Boone stood beside the freezer in the church kitchen, pretending to count serving spoons. Neither of them looked at me directly when I stepped in. That was part of why they were useful. They understood sequence. I gave Arthur the codicil copy and the envelope of emails from the flash drive. Not until he names himself, I said. Arthur nodded once. He will. I handed Margaret the consultant invoices, the access log copies, and the banker email. If he says Celeste has only been helping with arrangements, you answer first. I can do that. You don't embellish. She gave me a dry look. At my age, I don't decorate facts for men. The last packet went to Mr. Bell from First County when he arrived with his widow's pin still on his lapel from his own loss the year before. I gave him the trust note, the signatory request, and the housing review copy with my name clipped to the top. He read enough to understand what kind of night this had become. If Arthur opens that codicil, and it says what I think it says, he told me, I'll confirm the account structure on the spot. That was my system. Arthur for the dead, Margaret for the records, Belle for the money, and me for the room. When I stepped back into the fellowship hall, people were settling into their seats. The air had changed the way it does before weather breaks. Graham stood at the microphone with one hand braced on the podium, grief arranged neatly across his face. Celeste had taken the seat nearest the aisle, where people could see her profile if they turned to listen. He cleared his throat and looked out over my father's friends, our church people, the mill staff, the banker, the pastor, my cousins, my aunt, and the men who had spent 20 years letting my father's name carry weight in this town. There's something Robert would have wanted me to say, Graham began, and that was when I stood up with the brass key in my hand. I had known church basements my whole life. That was part of why Graham should have been afraid of this one. Not because it was grand, because it wasn't. A fellowship hall in a town like ours does not forgive easily once it has seen the right thing in the right light. People remember who stood in the family line at a funeral and who tried to edge into it. Memory sticks harder under fluorescent lights than it does in courtrooms. That was the room Graham had chosen for himself without understanding it. He wanted witnesses, not just for grief, for succession. He wanted my father's people to watch him step cleanly into the space beside the photograph and accept the town's sympathy as if sympathy were a deed transfer. So I let him have the microphone for 8 more seconds. I walked the center aisle with the brass key in my palm and the first sealed letter in my other hand. Enough people turned that the room shifted before I said a word. Graham saw me coming and smiled in that patient way men do when they think a woman is about to embarrass herself for their benefit. Pastor Wren started to rise. Mr. Bell from First County set his coffee down. Aunt Louise went still with a napkin in her hand. Celeste did not move, though I saw her back straighten as I passed. The front of the room smelled like ham glaze, old coffee, floor wax, and lilies on their second day. My father's framed photograph sat to the left of the podium, jaw set, eyes narrowed slightly, as if even death had not made him more willing to indulge a fool. Graham touched the microphone stand. Nora, he said softly, so the room would hear how gentle he was trying to sound. You don't need to do this. I stepped beside the podium rather than behind it. I was not asking for my turn after him. I was stopping him before he took the room any farther. My father left instructions, I said, and he did not leave them with you. The hall had already gone attentive in the way real rooms do. Forks paused, chairs settled, conversations thinned but did not disappear all at once. People were listening while pretending not to, which is when truth travels best in small towns. Graham gave a short laugh. Arthur and I have already discussed the legal side. No, I said. You discussed the side that would fit in your mouth. A few heads turned then. My cousin David looked down into his tea. Celeste crossed one leg over the other and tried for composure, but her hand tightened once on the tablecloth. Graham angled his body toward me so the room would read concern instead of challenge. This is grief talking. It's records talking, I said. Then I put the brass key on the podium. The sound it made was small, hard, final. That key did what shouting never could. It made the whole thing physical. Not a marital quarrel, not a daughter losing composure. An object, a lock. A dead man who had planned for exactly this. Arthur rose then, slow and spare, with the second sealed envelope under his arm. Margaret Boone stepped out from the kitchen doors at nearly the same moment. Mr. Bell had already unfolded his glasses. 3 kinds of authority. That was what Graham had failed to calculate. The dead, the books, the bank. His eyes moved among them, and, for the first time all day, I saw something underneath the polish. Math. He was counting odds. Nora, he said, lower now, don't turn your father's supper into something ugly. You started that in the receiving line. The words landed, not because they were clever, because half the room had seen it. Celeste finally stood. I think I should leave. Graham reached for her wrist without looking at her, a reflex more intimate than careful, and the gesture itself betrayed him. A few people near the front saw it too. Pastor Wren's wife lowered her eyes. Aunt Louise did not. No, I said, before Graham could answer for either of us. Stay, since you came dressed for family. That was the line that changed the temperature. People were no longer deciding whether I was too wounded to trust. They were beginning to decide what exactly they had been expected to swallow. I held up my father's first letter. He told me to use the key before nightfall if Graham began speaking for him or for me. Arthur stopped beside the podium at last. Robert also left something else, he said. Graham's face emptied in a way I had never seen before. Arthur laid the second sealed envelope on the podium beside the key and my father's photograph, then looked straight at Graham. You may want to sit down, he said. Arthur did not tell Graham to sit down twice. He only laid the second sealed envelope on the podium beside the brass key and my father's photograph, and let the room feel the weight of a dead man, still having better timing than the living. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Somebody near the kitchen dropped a serving spoon into a stainless pan and then froze, as if even that small sound had become disrespectful. Graham kept one hand on the microphone stand. Arthur, he said, trying for that strained little smile men use when they want authority to look confused instead of threatened. This is hardly the moment. Arthur said nothing. So Graham turned back to the room and reached for the version of himself he trusted most, the steady one, the son-in-law who could speak through hard things with his voice low and his tie straight. Robert loved this community, he began, and he cared deeply about keeping the mill stable through change. That's all I've tried to do. Tonight isn't about conflict. It's about honoring him the right way. The right way. That was the line he wanted them to carry home. Not the mistress in black, not the family table, not the payroll changes or the housing review or the consultant invoice. Just a reasonable man trying to protect a dead man's legacy from disorder. I could feel people wanting to believe him, not because he deserved it, because towns like ours prefer continuity to mess, and a man holding a microphone often looks more reasonable than a woman standing beside a secret. So I picked up my father's first letter and read it aloud. If Graham begins to speak for me, or for you, use the key before nightfall. No one moved. Then I set the letter down and looked straight at Graham. My father did not ask you to honor him. He warned me you would try to inherit the sound of his voice. That one traveled. Not loudly, not like gossip, more like a cold draft under a door. I saw it move across faces that had known my father too long to mistake his habits. Pastor Wren lowered his eyes. Aunt Louise straightened in her chair. Mr. Bell from First County folded his hands over his stomach and waited. Margaret Boone stepped out from the kitchen doors with her folder against her chest. If stability was the goal, she said, Mr. Whitfield wouldn't have asked me to strip Nora's payroll authority before her father was buried. The hall changed in small ways first. A fork set down. A chair scraped. Pastor Wren's wife turned fully in her seat. Celeste looked toward Graham for instruction and did not get it fast enough. Graham's face did not break, but I saw the calculation underneath it sharpen. Margaret, he said, almost warmly, you're misunderstanding a temporary measure. She opened the folder. Temporary started Friday at 3:12 p.m. You requested emergency authority realignment due to family hardship. You also submitted a consultant invoice under Celeste Vale for transition work billed to family operations. That landed harder than any accusation I could have thrown, because Margaret did not sound wounded. She sounded exact. Celeste spoke then for the first time all evening. I never asked for any of this. Her voice was soft enough that someone else might have mistaken it for innocence. But I had seen her hand at his neck in my father's kitchen. I had seen her wrist in his mouth over my father's desk. I looked at her. You stood in the family line. Aunt Louise let out one short breath through her nose. David stared into his plate. Near the back, one of the dock supervisors muttered something that made the man beside him go quiet. Graham lifted a hand, trying to calm the room he had walked into, believing he already owned. This is being made uglier than it is, he said. Celeste was helping with image and communication because Robert knew Nora wasn't in a place to handle public strain. Not was. Wasn't. He had buried me before the coffin was cold. I stepped closer to the podium. You brought your appetite to my father's funeral. He went still. That was the first real crack. Not outrage. Stillness. The kind that comes when a true sentence lands in front of witnesses and leaves no elegant place to stand. Mr. Bell rose from his chair then, slow and careful with his reading glasses in one hand. Did Robert authorize company funds for this consultant? Graham's answer came too fast. There were conversations. Not what I asked, Bell said. Arthur finally reached for the second envelope. Graham turned toward him. Arthur, for God's sake, don't turn a family supper into a legal spectacle. Arthur slid one finger beneath the seal. Robert turned it into evidence, he said, and then he opened the envelope. The sound the seal made was almost polite. That was the worst of it. Not dramatic, not loud, just paper giving way in a room where Graham had expected emotion to outrun documentation. Arthur unfolded the codicil slowly. The fellowship hall had gone so still, I could hear the old refrigerator in the church kitchen kick on behind Margaret Boone. 8 days before his death, Arthur said, Robert Whitfield executed this codicil in my presence. Graham tried one last interruption. Arthur, you know Robert was medicated by then. Arthur did not look at him. I also brought a physician witness for capacity. Sit down. That did it. Graham's hand slipped off the microphone stand. He did not sit, but the room no longer belonged to him. Arthur read the operative clause first. My father transferred controlling voting authority in Whitfield Mill and Supply into a separate Whitfield Trust under my sole control, effective immediately upon his death. No spouse of mine could exercise interim authority. No marital claim could attach to those shares. Any attempt to alter signatory control without my written consent and bank confirmation was void. The words were dry, legal, clean. They hit like a gate slamming shut. Mr. Bell stepped forward before Graham could recover. "First County holds the trust certification," he said. "What Arthur read is correct. Mr. Whitfield requested that no spousal authority attach to Nora's control position under any circumstance short of legal incapacity." Graham stared at him. "You knew?" "I knew what was on file," Bell said. "I did not know you intended to move faster than the burial." That line moved through the room harder than grief had. Arthur lifted the printed emails next. He did not need all of them, only enough. He read the subject line first. "If filing waits until after services, optics improve." Then another. "Rebrand after Nora is out." Celeste made a sound then, low and frightened, like she had finally understood Graham could no longer protect the version of her that arrived in black and stood where family should have stood. Margaret opened her folder one last time. "I can verify the payroll request, the consultant invoices, and the housing review packet clipped to Nora's file," she said. "All before Mr. Whitfield was buried." Graham tried indignation next. "This is insane," he said. "I was trying to keep the place from collapsing. Nora was in no condition to run anything." I looked at him then. At the loosened tie, the careful grief, the fury leaking through because the room had stopped taking instruction from his face. "You thought grief would make me smaller," I said. "My father left me records." That was the moment he lost the last layer. Informational control had gone with the codicil. Social control had gone when Belle and Margaret stood beside Arthur. Moral framing died there, in front of my father's photograph, because everyone in that room could finally see that Graham had not stepped up under pressure. He had tried to feed on it. Pastor Wren rose first, then David, then Aunt Louise set her napkin down and said, "Robert knew exactly which snake he let into the house." No one defended Graham after that. Celeste reached for her purse. Graham reached for her wrist by reflex, and she pulled free so sharply her chair tipped behind her. Arthur laid the opened codicil beside the brass key. I took off my wedding ring, placed it on top of the papers, and finally gave Graham the sentence he had earned. "You were never the name," I said. "You were only standing near it." He went white. Mr. Bell asked Margaret for the office keys. Arthur asked Graham to surrender any company credentials by morning. Pastor Wren asked 2 men from the mill to walk Celeste to the parking lot. None of it required a raised voice. I picked up the brass key, left the ring where it was, and stepped away from the podium. Behind me, the room had already begun the oldest, coldest miracle I know. It was learning how to speak about him correctly. The next morning, I unlocked my father's office before sunrise. The mill always smelled different before the phone started. Cold dust, coffee from the break room not yet burnt, saw oil faint in the walls. The place had been carrying my family longer than I had been alive, and for the first time since my father got sick, I stepped into it without waiting for someone else's voice to tell me where to stand. Margaret Boone was already there with her cardigan buttoned wrong and a fresh legal pad on my desk. "I changed the approvals back," she said. "Payroll, vendor release, housing access. Bell's office confirmed the trust at 6:30. I nodded and set my handbag down beside the old adding machine. No speech, no tears, just systems returning to their proper names. By mid-morning, Graham's access cards were dead. His signature authority was gone, and the company house lease was back under the trust structure my father had built. Celeste's invoices were flagged for review. Arthur sent over copies of the codicil, the trust memo, and the physician affidavit in one thick envelope with a note clipped to the front. Your father expected grief. He did not excuse greed. I kept that note in the top drawer. People in town adjusted faster than I expected. That is one mercy of small places. Once a room sees the right truth, it saves itself the effort of pretending for long. The churchwomen stopped lowering their voices around me. Men who had once looked past me to shake Graham's hand started asking whether I wanted the summer vendor lunch kept on schedule. Pastor Wren sent a pound cake and did not write a single foolish word about healing. Even Aunt Louise, who had spent most of my life believing volume counted as strength, only touched my shoulder once and said, "Your daddy would have liked that you stayed cold." Graham called twice the first week. I let it ring. Then he sent one email about misunderstanding, timing, pressure, and what people do when they are afraid. I read exactly 3 lines before deleting it. He had already had his chance to explain himself. He used it at the funeral. By the second week, I moved my father's chair back 2 inches from the desk and brought in my own mug from home, the blue one with the chipped handle. The mornings settled into work. Freight claims, insurance renewals, a roof estimate on Bay 3. I still missed my father at strange hours, when the noon whistle blew, when a truck backed badly against the loading dock, when I found one of his notes in the margin of an accounts receivable file telling me to stop being polite and charge interest. Grief did not leave. It just stopped being the only thing in the room. That was the piece of it. Not happiness, not triumph, just room. Room to drink coffee while it was still hot. Room to leave one lamp on in the office after dark and know it was because I was finishing work, not proving I could survive it. Room to carry the Whitfield name without letting it crush me or turn me soft for the wrong people again. A month later, I took my wedding band to the jeweler and had the stone reset into a plain pendant. Not to remember Graham. To remember the cost of mistaking proximity for loyalty. I wear it sometimes under my blouse where nobody sees it. That feels right. And if you have ever sat in a room where someone tried to make you smaller while calling it help, then you already know this much. Silence is not always surrender. Sometimes it is the hand that keeps the record steady until the truth can speak in its own name.